All right, welcome to the Miami Tech Pod. We got a great episode in store for you, but before we get into it, I want to tell you a little bit about our sponsor. When you're running a startup and you're in the tech industry, what's more important than recruiting and finding great talent? So I'm really excited to tell you about Ramrack Recruiting, which specializes in working with startups and small, fast-growing companies. They have a genuine, people-oriented approach with honesty and trust. They're Miami-based. They operate with a real, friendly, approachable culture, and they already are having a great impact for their clients, candidates, and are partnered with recruiting firms for executives, tech, product, HR, operations, sales, marketing positions, you name it. Reach out at ramrack.com, ramrak.com. They want to hear from you and see what value they can add. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 12 of the Miami Tech Pod. I'm Cesar Fernandez, and as always, I'm joined by Brian Breslin, Maria Durchie, and Will Weinrob. And we have an exciting guest today on the pod, Alex Roy, who is a contender for the real-life Dos Equis Most Interesting Man in the World. But Alex is the Director of Special Operations at Argo AI, a self-driving car company that's been operational here in Miami for a while. And we'll talk a lot about that, but I mean, a really interesting background and life story. Alex, welcome to the Miami Tech Pod.
Thanks so much for having me on, everybody. I've been listening to your show since I moved to Miami, so thanks for doing this.
And we'll say a new Miami resident. You come to us from New York, right?
I was a New Yorker my whole life. I lived in Pittsburgh for a bit when I joined Argo, and I just came down here in December. And so I just immediately I was like, what do I listen to? Like, how do I find interesting people? What's going on? And Refresh Miami, your podcast.
So we met, at a Florida Automated Vehicle Summit a while back. And it's really interesting because I met you as a bit of a self-driving car skeptic. You talked about agency and people's desire for driving their own vehicles, and you had a really entertaining kind of keynote speech at that conference. But now you're an executive at one of the world's leading self-driving car companies. Talk a little bit about that journey.
Well, I obviously I love driving and I love cars, but I'm also a huge I'm a tech geek. Like I've always been an early adopter of pretty much anything my whole life, and I was an angel investor for many years. And when I first learned of self-driving vehicles like being potentially like a real thing about 10 years ago when the Google project went public, it seemed obvious to me that this was going to happen. The only question was, what's the business? Like, who's actually going to build an actual business around it? And so about 5 years ago, when a lot of media started coming out around self-driving cars, it was really clear that some of the claims being made about timelines and what was going to happen when they arrived were just not serious. And the most obvious one was no one was ever going to own a car again. No one was ever going to drive again. And traffic, pollution, and crashes would be eliminated, like to zero. And none of those things make any sense as a student of business or history. And so my skepticism was around the business models. And I launched a podcast called Autonicast, and I began speaking at conferences. But I was also, at the same time, doing some angel investing in the sector. And around the time I met you was around the time I began meeting the CEOs of some of these companies. And one of them was the CEO and co-founder of Argo AI, and he was the first leader of any of these very seriously funded companies who said something that made sense to me, which is people will still own cars and drive, but we can also provide an alternative, which may solve some problems. And the first and most obvious one is just safety. And so that approach made sense to me. And he made me like one of those kind of movie offers, like an offer you can't refuse, which is help educate people on the reality of self-driving vehicles. And I'm like, something, I'm for the first time in my life, I'm going to jump the wall and I'm going to go to a private corporation.
Very cool. And you've been, so one of the things that a lot of people may know you about or know about you
is that you've had a bit of a daredevil of a life, right? You've done some really neat things. You hold, or at one point, broke and held 7 records for the Cannonball run. And for people that don't know, that the Cannonball Run is a race, may or may not be legal, but a race from New York to Los Angeles. And do you want to kind of, I know you and Brian went back and forth on Twitter a little bit about this, or I may have introduced you as someone who's been involved with these shenanigans. But do you want to tell a little bit, to our listeners about what the Cannonball Run is and your involvement with that?
No, the Cannonball Run is bad and it's illegal, and no one should ever do such thing ever.
It's a disclaimer.
And I'm a parent, and I work in the safety business now, and I invest in things which try to make our roads safer. However, there were people, very bad men and women, who back, starting 100 years ago, who were trying to drive cross country as quickly as possible. And at the dawn of the motor car era, a guy named Irwin Baker, Cannonball Baker, was hired by Cadillac and Stutz to drive internal combustion vehicles cross country for marketing purposes. And the thesis behind companies backing that was that internal combustion was safer, polluted less, and more reliable than horses and trains. That was the thesis. And in the 70s, there was an illegal race, breaking limits. That was more of a political, cultural statement. And then no one did it for decades. And about 15, 16 years ago, I decided to go out and break the record. I've done it in a gas car and in an electric car and a 3-wheeled car. And now I'm retired from that because it doesn't, I've grown up and it's irresponsible. But I'm curious, Brian, you tweeted last week that you wanted to know if anyone had driven from Florida to where? Where'd you?
I think it was to Seattle, right? And then I later found out that you had done it in a Volvo, but not at high speed, right?
Well, we did it. That was actually a Volvo factory-backed campaign,
right?
About to demonstrate the driver assistance in a Volvo. We did it fairly quickly, but we hit 2 major storms. The most interesting thing about Cannonball is not that it's illegal or anything. It's that in order to do it, and I want to say quote unquote successfully, it's a very quantitative exercise. You cannot just get in a car. You can't just go buy a sports car, get in it and floor it and go. You will be arrested, you will fail, and it's going to be unsafe. But there are many, when I did it, and no, people have said it was impossible. I spent years learning the ins and outs of Google Earth, which had previously been Keyhole, a mapping project that DoD was sold to Google, and there were no map editing tools. Google Maps barely existed, and I used that and a combination of public sources to create a massive database of traffic and weather factors and map out how one would drive cross country safely and avoid obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very quantitative, and that jump-started my book tour, which accidentally led to my career in autonomous driving and safety, because all the tools I used, maps, HD maps, video, camera, understanding radar, LiDAR, data gathering, and also like recency of map data, for my purposes, was years later I learned identical to all the hardware and software tools that had to be automated for the purpose of making vehicles safe and autonomous. And so that's a wild coincidence. So that's the connection.
What's the record, by the way? Like how fast did you do that first run?
Before I answer that, Maria, do you have a question that's not about illegal activity?
I was just going to say, so you didn't use Waze. This wasn't like, I'm just going to plop it into Waze and ride over.
Waze didn't exist, but since you're all tech investors and people understand, technology companies' policy, think about what Waze actually did. So they crowdsourced data in real time from users, and which is location and time and speed of the vehicle, the phone in the vehicle, combined with manual entry of data by the drivers of by Waze users, which is I see a police officer, I see an accident, things that you can't automate or you couldn't automate when Waze first came out. And so I had to, with my team, manually create all that data. There was no crowdsourcing, by driving cross country repeatedly, shooting video, and then manually taking notes. And so Waze shaves years off of research for the purpose of driving cross country. And that's now true of many other forms of data for commuters.
So follow-up question was, I heard there was a plane involved. Can you speak to that?
There was a legend of a plane having been used in the 80s in a race called the U.S. Express, which was a successor to the Cannonball. And I found the footage of that plane being used as a spotter for the vehicle in 1983, which set the record that year of 32 hours and 7 minutes. And so I happened to have a friend who had a pilot's license, and he and another friend who's a pilot for United agreed to fly overhead. And on the first run, we learned, and this goes back to the quantitative component, we learned that if you reprogram the ECU in a BMW to be more efficient in sixth gear, that you and carry enough fuel, you can outrun the plane, which we did. So we had to go again and with another faster plane, and we did break the record. And there's some spectacular footage taken from that plane. But let me stress, it's illegal, it's dangerous. I'm retired, and I work in safety now. And my dream someday is that eventually there will be an autonomous vehicle that will cross the country. I mean, when I mean autonomous, I mean there is no human intervention by an occupant of the vehicle, that I would be the first person to be in that vehicle and declare like the safest cross-country drive of all time. And that has always been kind of my dreams, that I would be the first to do something wild, but let's also make it like good, like for a good purpose.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about electrification in the industry. I mean, you did this, you've driven cross country in a Tesla and had the record for the fastest Cannonball in a electric vehicle. Did that completely change the way you optimize for that race? Obviously there's the charging element to it, but like talk a little bit about that experience and your learnings from it.
So it became obvious to me as a car enthusiast. I was always amazed. People would say, well, why don't you just take it to the track? And my answer is, well, at the track, how much can you learn? I mean, there are things you can learn, but you learn a lot more by taking a new technology and putting it into really out of left field, really putting it to the test. And so I made a chart of the Cannonball records from 1915 through 2015 of the times. And then I did some research into the history of gas stations and the gas station sector. Like, why didn't Ford or GM back 100 years ago, why didn't they verticalize gas stations and own them all? Why didn't they? For you wanted to buy gas in 1915, you had to go to a hardware store and buy it out of a milk jug. And so the fact that Tesla was verticalizing the charging was very interesting. And so I started charting that and looking at where the gaps were in the map, and then calculated that the electric vehicle times would fall as the Tesla network was built out. And then again, when the battery power density improved, and again, when a competing company started duplicating these business initiatives. And so I realized that I could start breaking the electric records with very little effort. I just had to wait for Tesla to deploy more stations and the batteries to improve and the software updates to show up. And eventually an OEM would do the same. And so that was there was a lot of experimentation involved, and trying to figure out the optimal exterior temperatures for has a lot of effect on the battery, as well as the battery temperature itself when you arrive at a charging station. And then there was the first year in 2015 or 16, there were still gaps in the Tesla network. So you could do some sections like at the speed limit, then other sections you had to go like half the speed limit in order to get to cross the gap. Today, the Tesla network and also the Electrify America network, which is VW's network in the United States, are good enough that you don't have to do like crawl stages. But there's a lot to be learned about thermal management and battery tech. I mean, whatever one's political views, electrification is the future. It's like not even a debate. Maybe there's some future for hydrogen, but internal combustion engines don't have double-digit improvements left in them. Technologically, they're single-digit, and electrification has double digits for decades to come.
Yeah, Will, I see you're A, a Tesla owner, and B, quietly taking a lot of notes here. What do you think?
Yeah, I've been waiting for my opportunity to jump in because I got a lot to ask you, Alex. I'm a big Tesla fanboy. Love the company. Really excited by it. At the same time, I have some issues with the way they've marketed their autopilot
Yes.
stuff. Right. Frankly, when I get in my car,
you and Alex both, by the way,
Yeah.
he's been a very, very loud critic about this.
Right. So I have a big problem with it. As much as I love the company, I'm going to call out some issues where I see them. And the big thing, I have a Model X. I love the car. Got it because it was also marketed as one of the safest vehicles you can get in, right? 5-star safety rating in every category, etc. Get in. Obviously, I tried the autopilot. Works okay, kind of. It's not really autopilot, but it works. I do it with my wife in the car, and she says, absolutely never again. Like, am I in the car and you're turning that thing on? If you're by yourself in the car, she says, go ahead, knock yourself out. But if I'm in the car with the kids, don't touch that thing, right? So I guess my question is twofold. Number one, how do we get skeptics on board like my wife to kind of start trusting autonomous driving? And then B, again, autopilot in general, I think is part of the issue. I tell my wife it's autopilot. It's not. It's enhanced cruise control is basically what that is at the moment, right? So I know the questions kind of tie in together, but I just want your take on that overall sentiment.
All right. So, well, first of all, autopilot is not autonomous. It's
Exactly.
automated, and it requires a human.
Yep.
And so does everything Tesla's doing. Look, this is not rocket science. It's not a pun. None of this autonomous vehicles are not rocket science. Everybody gets into an Uber or a Lyft or a taxi with a human driver all the time. We do it all the time. And when we do that, we assume no liability for what happens. The cab company does, the driver, Uber, everybody else but us. We're in the back. And we can sleep and go on Instagram. When an autonomous vehicle is a vehicle that does exactly that, and that's all it does. And when it works, you don't even think about it. You can go on your phone, you can take a nap, whatever. If you have to sit in front and you have any liability or responsibility, that's not autonomous. It's not. It's driver assistance. And so I have 2 Teslas. I love them. But this notion that they're autonomous, it's a dangerous notion and misunderstanding. And there have been many crashes. And the argument, of course, is, well, humans crash all the time. I'm like, yeah, they do. And there's a lot of things we can do to improve that. A lot. One of them is to be honest about what is autonomy and what isn't. And what's the product? I mean, look, we're all startup people here. What is the product of an autonomous vehicle? It's not an autonomous vehicle. The product is I pay X, I get in the back, and I don't even think about my personal safety, and I have no liability. That's the product. That's it.
Right.
It seems like
that's the framing.
Go ahead, Brian.
I think that's the framing of what's the job to be done, really, right? Yeah. Because the job to be done is I don't want to be responsible for driving myself, right? And so you can either solve it by paying another human, like you just said, like Uber, taxi, Lyft, whatever, or you pay the car, right? And
that's it. So, I mean, and Tesla's, confusing the market and markets and inflating valuations with the notion that you can just buy a car today that will do that. But it doesn't, and it's unlikely, even if it could at some point, it's not going to do it everywhere in all conditions, which unlocks the second piece of value, which is businesses in logistics that move stuff want to move stuff cheaper and more reliably. And they don't do it just in nice places, they do it everywhere. So FedEx, UPS, all these companies, what do they want? They don't want a truck with nobody inside. They want a truck that is safer with a guy inside who's doing different things, better things, more efficiently. So,
Alex, do you feel that that's how skeptics like my wife are going to come around to autonomous vehicles, where all of a sudden we're going to see logistically that you know, a lot of things with cars that are autonomous without humans in them. You see all these nodes going around the country safely. Things are being delivered. No crashes are being reported. Then folks like my wife see that data and they say, wow, look at all this stuff happening out there. I guess it is safe. Now we're going to just, be more comfortable with getting our kids in a car and doing autonomy. How do you
Yeah,
see
I
it
mean,
rolling out to that?
a lot of it's cultural. I just read this great book on the history of elevators, which I think is the most analogous to autonomous vehicles. When elevators first showed up, they were a luxury item, and then they were deployed commercially. They were There were some issues with elevators being used in mines in Germany in the middle of the 19th century, and in this country, we had elevator operators, which were largely unnecessary. All
Right.
the pieces of automation and reliability were in place by 1900. There was really no reason to have elevator operators after that. No technical reason, and yet it took another 50 years before there was a precipitating event that led to the end of the elevator operator era, which still took another 20 years to 1970. And people felt that they needed an elevator operator in order to be safe, even though the safety was baked into the engineering of the elevator system. And starting around in the late 1940s, the addition of Muzak, an emergency button, and an intercom culturally shifted the, I guess, critical mass of trust and to we don't need an actual operator there. And the fact that people felt they had agency over how the elevator worked is how that trust came to be. So an autonomous vehicle has to be one in which the passenger still has agency. They're just not necessarily making moment-to-moment decisions about braking and throttle and steering. So,
Yeah. Do you think that in Miami, for better or for worse, isn't necessarily like a city, and Miami-Dade County is not a county with like the best public transportation system, right? Like that, we all know that. We can be honest about it. The traffic here is horrendous, etc. Do we feel that actually is an accelerant to testing autonomous vehicles here, or just because there's a little bit more higher stakes, or is it still the engineering reality of like it doesn't snow or rain here and that's the most important part?
well, think of well, first of all, Miami's a great city and I love it. And yes, the mass transit is suboptimal, but there's a few factors as to why it's a great city in which to test and eventually deploy autonomous vehicles. One of which is, the weather is good most of the year, which is better for the early generations of autonomous vehicles. Secondly, you have these. It's not a how do you say? You don't have. It's not a single core city. You have multiple communities that any one of which could benefit from the deployment, even singly. But if you start linking them together, then you start seeing some real benefits. And then you've got a lot of delivery and logistics issues. So you tick a lot of boxes, especially it's a business-friendly state. So when I was looking at the different cities I was going to move to that in which Argo is testing, Miami was the obvious one, and not just because it's the first city in which Argo intends to deploy with their partner Ford, because it's a city. It's, I want to say, a blank slate, but the opportunity on so many levels, and not just for transportation innovation, but in startups in general. Your podcast is an example of this. Refresh is an example of this, because autonomous vehicles, like elevators, are not just an accelerant, but almost an amplifier, like an exponential multiplier of opportunity and value creation. I always come back to elevators. Before elevators were electrified and could go more than 7 stories high, all the value in real estate was in the first 2 floors of a building. Inventory and lower income people were stored on higher floors, 6th and 7th floor. Plumbing barely existed. If it did, it didn't run up to the higher floors. Everything was inverted. And when the convergence of 3 technologies happened, electrification, steel building construction, which unlocked skyscrapers, and electrification. And the last part was the current war between Edison and Westinghouse, alternating versus direct current. The the debate was whether you needed one power plant for a city or a power plant in every basement. So the fact that we got AC power, which the fact that we ended up with citywide power grids, single generators for large areas, allowed the installation of elevators and the building of buildings with steel infrastructure that were taller. All of that in the late 1880s, early 1890s unlocked and inverted value. Suddenly, higher buildings, apartments, penthouses on the top floors, extraordinary value, and street level retail was unlocked in a huge way because you were no longer giving up any space for a low level real estate, for residential real estate. So take that and apply it to transportation, and autonomy unlocks probably similar consequences in cities like Miami. So.
I think it's kind of interesting to think about also all the different autonomous vehicle or AV or AV technologies and companies is almost like platforms. And I'm hoping we see these things sort of evolving the way APIs and other sort of centralized tech stacks have over the years, because there's so much potential for innovation and potential for use cases and sort of independent thought around this stuff if we give people access to the platform to build on top of. I think a similar example would be like, what's going to be the Raspberry Pi of AV, right? And I know that there's obviously tons of safety and litigation issues and all that, but 5 years, 10 years from now, it'd be amazing to be able to see teenagers, hacking away on the Argo dev kit, to build their go-kart into an AV go-kart or something like that.
Well, I can't tell you what that would look like in the context of Argo, but it is really reassuring to go and look at. Chris Anderson, the former editor-in-chief of Wired, has a thing called DIY Robocar, an event out west. It was a competition to build very low-cost Raspberry Pi-based autonomous vehicles that size your hand, and a lot of engineers at AV companies and just at tech in general compete in that. There's a really great thing called First Robotics, which was founded by Dean Kamen, the inventor of the Segway, which is what he calls the Super Bowl of AI and robotics. And that's a fantastic series, for kids to learn, skills. And then you've got things like the India Autonomous Challenge and the Robo Race, which are attacking this from the other side. So I'm a super optimist that we're going to see, opportunities flower off of these platforms. And well, that's all I can say about that.
This is awesome, Alex. Thanks for kind of sharing your wisdom and overall experience in all things, from autonomous vehicles to the Cannonball race. We're going to talk a little bit about some other topics here. I'd love for you to stick around and weigh in on these things. Next, I'll kind of shift gears here. We had a really big news this week from the Miami Foundation, where they had an initiative to ensure that 100,000 Miami-Dade County students are going to have free internet access. I know this is like really central to building a vibrant community here in Miami of, pipeline from like kids that learn coding, but may not necessarily have the means to continue those skills at homes, because we have one of the largest kind of gaps in connectivity here. I think it's 1 in every 5 people in Miami-Dade County don't have access to reliable internet. So the Miami Foundation and a organization called Achieve Miami, they first started with $5 million in CARES Act funding for actual purchasing of devices during the pandemic, but then they really made this shift that they announced this week to making sure that these kids have a sustainable kind of source for broadband internet. And we saw some people really stepping up to the plate in terms of funding. The Citadel Group's CEO, Ken Griffin, donated $5 million. You had, sizable contributions from the Miami Foundation itself, the City of Miami, the Children's Trust, et cetera. What do you all think about this? And what do you think it does to, our startup ecosystem here?
So I'll chime in first. I think this is actually a really big thing for us, because there's systemic challenges that this is based on, or this is built up from. Whether it's financial, whether it's credit, there's business model challenges as to why a lot of these folks don't have access to internet, other than the fact that the cost. But in mobile phones, there's prepaid versus postpaid. And so the Metro PCSs versus the T-Mobiles, right? And so you end up seeing a lot of the folks, and I'm guessing, who are in this cohort who don't have home internet access are probably in the cohort of folks who are relying on prepaid in mobile phone plans. And so there isn't an equivalent analog in home internet access. And so I think because of that, this move will open up a ton of accessibility to folks who otherwise are being unfortunately excluded because of the business model of how internet providers work. And so I think this is going to do a ton to foster the tech and the sort of overall economy of Miami in 10 years or 15 years. This is one of those things that has a long-term payoff, but it's something we need to be investing in. And we should also be tapping into the Starlinks of the world and stuff like that to bring a variety of internet providers to this cluster of folks.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brian. I mean, what do we think? Maria, I'd love your thoughts on this, right? This was kind of a big community initiative to tackle a problem with relatively small amount of investment from government, right? The city of Miami put $50,000 in. I think while meaningful, and that certainly helps, it's certainly a small minority of the amount of dollars that went in this. Do you think, Maria, that we're going to continue seeing investors, the VC community, companies, donors identify some of these systemic problems in building a tech ecosystem and putting money to deploy against those?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. And I feel like there are a lot of conversations that are happening right now across the ecosystem about, other issues. Knight Foundation mentioned their big grant to the universities, but there's also talk about tackling it from an even earlier stage. And so without, I don't have any news to share yet, but I'm hearing more and more conversations around a lot of the new folks and the current folks kind of getting together and saying, how can we tackle these different issues, which is really exciting. And I know chatting with Rebecca Fishman-Lipsey, who heads up this initiative at Miami Foundation, they are still looking for partners and support. So those who are really interested in this initiative, definitely reach out to her. She's incredible. And so I just want to put that quick plug, because I do think, like what you mentioned, Cesar, that they're doing a lot with a little, and we could really kind of help it go a lot farther if we get some more partners in there.
There's no argument against this. And, there's so often this topics that shouldn't become a left-right issue do. This isn't one of them. Like, if you believe in the values, the common values that make this country a great place to move and Miami a great place to live, you have to support this, because there's so much talent and genius that, again, remaining to be unlocked, that doesn't have access to basic internet. Provide it to them, and we will find more talent and build more businesses and make the city an even better place to live.
Yeah, I frankly didn't realize, and this is just me being naive, but it probably also like, a bit of privilege here, right? Like, I didn't realize that the gap was that big, right? One out of every 5 people don't have access to reliable internet. I mean, that's a problem that the Miami Foundation and all of these partners are trying to solve here. It's kind of incredible, right? We talk a lot about, and we've had some guests on the show talk about, humble beginnings and their humble roots here in Miami. All 4 of us are public school kids from Miami that have done well in the startup and tech ecosystem. And I think it's something that is really like kind of a foundational thing, right? It is very hard for a kid to dream or even tone deaf for them to like be told in a public school setting, hey, by the way, like we now have access to coding classes in school, but then when they go home, they can't actually study or prepare or continue that education, right? So it's one of these, like, I'm just really bullish on solving these like root problems that create those ladders to opportunities like this, like housing affordability, all that becomes the foundation that, a startup ecosystem stack can be built on top of. And this is like a really neat thing to see.
Yeah, I had no idea either. I mean, look at the statistics here that they shared that Miami was the second worst connected city in the country in just 2015. So about 6 years ago. So that's crazy. 37% of households with no internet access whatsoever. So, definitely something that we need to fix, and great to see initiatives like this at the forefront of fixing those problems.
And the fact that Hialeah is up there too, that's
crazy.
That's crazy.
It's crazy.
All right, so let's shift gears to the third segment here. Will, what do you have for us?
So some big news. Our illustrious co-host here, Maria Durci, has a new role. Very exciting. Insert applause, insert air horns, insert all the post-production stuff. Congratulations, Maria, as your new role as Director of Community at Florida Funders. I think I speak for the rest of the folks on this pod that they could have picked no one better for this role. Really excited about it, and we're really proud of you. But from you, would love to hear what this role is all about, and then how you're going to be also splitting your time with Refresh and all that good stuff.
And how big the checkbook is, let's be honest.
Yes, that's good.
I insert make it rain.
Yeah. We'll do the money falling from the sky effect.
Exactly. No, I'm really excited to join the team and help get more South Florida companies funded. My role will be really focused on helping them grow their brand in South Florida, helping them find incredible startups to invest in. So it's very complementary to the work I do at Refresh, and so to me, it kind of gives me another tool in the toolbox to continue to help entrepreneurs down here. So we'll still kind of part-time Refresh, part-time Florida Funders. They're very there's a lot of overlap there. So it kind of made sense. And so I'm really excited. And they've already made 9 investments in Miami to date. And then, so it shows that they've, really have a commitment to both Miami and Florida in general. So quick plug, if you're raising money, we kind of focus on 7 industries: fintech, edtech, health tech, cybersecurity, e-commerce, SaaS, gig economy tools, any of that. My email is maria@floridafunders.com.
Right,
send me a note.
Okay,
very cool.
Maria is already the most popular person in Miami tech. Now she has a checkbook.
Oh yeah,
this is going to get wild. She's going to have to change her number. I'm glad I have Maria's real cell phone. All of you are about to have the fake one,
the burner.
But that's really exciting, Maria. Congrats. I know this is it's a huge move. It's really smart, frankly, for Florida funders to say like, hey, Miami's hot, but like it's a bit lazy to just parachute in, even though it's not far from Tampa, to set up meetings and then leave. Like, let's hire someone who actually knows and has been responsible for creating this community to be at the forefront of our deal flow. And I think that's super smart on their part, but really exciting for you. Have you started having meetings with founders, and have you made any investments?
So my first day was Monday. So just getting kind of onboarded. I have had some conversations this morning with an incredible founder that I know, Cesar, which will remain nameless. But yeah, just starting off those meetings now. And also, we're kind of growing our scout program in Miami. So starting to think about who might be good scouts. Not to say that any of these are in this call right now, but I may be hitting you guys up later.
Yeah, I mean, look, this was really a backdoor way to get Alex in the mix here. I mean, he's been an investor, so no. But
I would love
Alex,
to talk to you for sure.
Yeah, can I ask Alex, what, if you're feel free to share this or not, but like, what were some of those angel investments that you did make when you were in New York?
Oh, well, my investments in tech were in simulation primarily, and a couple in sensors. both of those are critical for the development of autonomous vehicles. I also was investing in the driver monitoring space. The problem, Will, that you pointed out with your Tesla or our Tesla, is that the vehicle doesn't have a proper driver monitoring system. So people overtrust technology and semi-automation, and then the system has no way of knowing that they're not paying attention, and then suboptimal things happen.
Correct.
So
And also not to go off on a tangent, but you would agree that autopilot was one of the worst marketing blunders I think a big company like that could have had, right?
Well,
that's just moniker.
Well, I would call it. It was the triumph and tragedy of that. Triumph because they were the first to use the word that way
Right.
in a car. And the tragedy is that they shouldn't have. But
Sure.
that one could do an entire marketing course at college level about that. But my other investments when I was a New Yorker were in restaurants and nightclubs and an event space. And unfortunately, COVID has kind of turned the page on several of those projects. But I was in for almost 20 years, and I missed that era of my life. Maria, I have imagined that you're looking at more substantive projects, things that'll change the world, not just the quality of my night. So.
Hey, we're open to all.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you offline after the show. Absolutely. I mean, Miami, when I look at just the regulatory framework and just kind of zoning and population density, I could see the city growing enormously over the next 10 to 20 years and replicating and surpassing some of the really magical elements of New York City. And I hope it does.
Well, feel free to, especially Alex, I know you're going to always be in touch with like companies and founders and operators who are kind of following your lead, leaving New York, moving here, building a bit of a network. Keep our co-host with the most, Maria Durkee, in mind for some deals to throw her way. She's building that portfolio, and it's we're gonna need to get some self-driving or autonomy startups in the mix there in her book.
Well, if I may shout out Argo AI, if you have a business in Miami or a community group of any kind, if you think that an autonomous vehicle service might be of some value to you, we want to talk to you. It's really important that technology not just be dropped on a city. It's really important that you start ground up talking to people in the communities. And Argo, I don't know if it's the original, but Argo was here really early, like back in 3 years ago, and invested a lot of money in Wynwood and now other facilities and is doing a lot of hiring. But we want to talk to businesses that would benefit from autonomy, and we want to work with them. So please contact us. Our website's www.argo.ai. You can email me, but Roy at Argo AI. We want to talk to you. It's a great city, and we're hiring too. So check out our website, and there's a link there.
Boom. All right, team. Anything else for the pod before we wrap up? Maria, any events on the horizon? I know you've been consistently on the top of the networking game here.
No, well, I host a bi-monthly. It used to be weekly, then it got a little much. But now it's bi-monthly. Welcome to Miami Zoom call. So check out the refresh calendar for that. It'll be the next one is next Friday. It's a quick 30 minutes. People get to introduce themselves, find out what other people are working on, and then they can continue that conversation offline. But it's a kind of mixture of new folks and folks that are moving here or interested in moving here.
Right.
So that's kind of the only virtual event we're doing these days, but hopefully more soon.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'll wrap up episode 12 of the Miami Tech Pod. Alex, Roy, thank you so much for joining the pod. Feel free to share this episode with your massive Twitter following. But no, thanks for joining, man. It was a really cool conversation, and we'll make sure that we get you back on the pod in future episodes here. And Maria, again, congrats on the new and exciting role. Pretty soon, we'll have to make sure that you're still, with us here. You may get to a big shot VC over here. Want to make sure she has time for the pod. This has been a really neat episode, and if you haven't already, please rate and subscribe the show on your favorite podcast app, and visit us on Twitter at Miami Tech Pod. It really means a lot when you tell your friends and share with folks in these episodes in the tech community. And we will see you all on episode 13. Take care.